Hello Voozers, today I'll be deriving the horns mesh that I made in the other video and adding a nice texture and opacity to it. Once in the editor, I add an outfit and a room that I like to use to derive in, and some hair that keeps things out of the way. With things out of the way, I can go back to the product page and get the textures. You can actually copy the texture directly, go to File, Create from New, and you can start working with the texture directly instead of saving it first. You can actually do the same for the UV map, but since it uses transparency, that can make it a little bit harder to see since it will take on some of the black. As you can see, it's a little bit difficult to work with this way. So for the UV map, I'm going to save it so it doesn't lose the transparency, and then I can open it directly on my texture to work with. So I locate the saved UV and open it as a new layer for my texture. As you can see, it's much easier to work with now. I already have an idea for what I want to do, so I'm going to create a new transparent layer. And by using the paintbrush in a color red, I'm going to start coloring in the tip of the horns. While I color this in, I'm mindful of the edges of the UV map so that it will be able to line up. That way I won't have any unsightly seams. I'm using my mouse, so I'm going to switch to the Smudge Tool and try and get a bit of a splatter effect because I want these horns to look like they're bloodied. Again, I do this and I'm mindful of the edges of the UV map. I duplicate the layer and I set them to multiply to make it a bit darker and to show a bit of the texture through. I then switch to the splatter brush again and start to paint on some directly. Now to add some color, I'm making another layer and I'm going to use the texture over top and set it to soft light. Now when I'm recording, for some reason it doesn't let me rearrange the layers, so I actually had to kind of copy the texture over top and make a new layer underneath for it. For some more texture, I go into the texture fill option, and on that layer I'm filling it in with the cracked mud, and that'll give it a bit more of a bone texture. And then I'm using the linear motion blur and setting it to vertical, which is 90 degrees. I then use the warp tool and set it to shrink so that I can get it in a line with the UV map. Just by shrinking the top section here. I can also switch it to move so I can adjust it a little bit more. I want to add some more shading on the bottom, so I make the UV map visible again and make a new layer and start to paint in with a similar color. Again, of course, following the lines. And I use the fill tool, and I forgot to change it back to the foreground color at first. And for this layer, I set it to multiply to make it darker. And then I blur it. The Gaussian blur is really useful for this, but you can also get in with your brush and do it a little bit. It is also important to save often and make sure that you preserve those layers in case you want to go back and edit them later. I also like to preview my textures often to make sure that they're looking the way I want them to. I want the red a bit darker, so I just duplicated the layer again. And I want to add some highlights to make it glisten, so I make another new layer and I start drawing things in with white. I'm also making use of the smudge and blur tools since I'm right now using the mouse and don't have any pressure opacity. I adjust the layers to get the look that I want. Using the pencil blur can really help you get some tiny detail in. Using the warp tool again, I can adjust the angle, just to help it flow with the map a little bit better. I press Ctrl E to export it again, and then try it out on IMVU to help get a bit more of an orientation of where everything will be. I want to add some more highlights, so I ended up duplicating the one I already made, and then flipped it horizontally. Then use the rotate tool as well. I then use the eraser tool to clean it up a little bit. I then messed around with the positioning a bit before uploading it to IMVU again so that I can try it out. I make another layer, and I use the brush tool and adjust the aspect ratio so I have a long, thin, soft strand, and I'm going to use that to create another highlight. I set the layer to soft light, and I added another one, and used the smudge and blur tools to get the look that I want. On another layer, I used the pencil tool and drew a line, and smudged it along. I use a soft eraser so I can divide up the line a little bit to give it a little bit less consistency so it doesn't just look like a white line. I tested it again on IMVU to see if it's looking how I want it to. I want to add a little bit more of a highlight down that center line. So make a new layer and start to draw in a little bit. I like to work with many layers so I can adjust things easily. I also don't like to set them all to overlay when I'm working with blood, and like to set some of them just to more translucent. I used the medium blur to soften it up a little bit, but I decided against it. Using the emboss on a different layer can help add some depth. I played around with the layers a little bit more, adding some more highlights and shadows in places that I thought it would look nice. I wanted the overall texture to be a bit darker, so I went to Layer, New from Visible, and set that one to Multiply. For a while I actually had trouble drawing blood and stuff like that, but I ended up getting over it a little bit. I really do like the red and white aesthetic. I always thought it looked really sharp. I could probably leave it here, but I want it to look a bit more like fresher blood. Having spatter like that's pretty good if it is on a porous surface, but I kind of want to make it look like it's dripping down the horns a little bit. So I'm going to use the Smudge Tool and kind of bring it up a little bit and try to make it look like there's some different streams. I made another layer and I'm going to use some black to kind of outline these drip lines a little bit better to give them a bit more depth. And once I'm done, I'll set this layer to overlay, or actually a soft light. I use the Gaussian blur a little bit to soften it up. And I added another layer just to help define the areas I want to stick out a little bit more. Using the mouse can sometimes take a little bit longer than the tablet, so sometimes I'm just on my couch though, so I don't have all my equipment on me. And with the shadows done, I decided to add in some highlights. I just used some white and a small paintbrush and start defining the edges a little bit. I set that layer to soft light and I use the smudge tool to soften up the ends. I then go back to using the pencil tool and add in some spots for some additional highlights. I smudged these too, but not too much. After another quick preview, I decide to add in some more highlights, again on another layer. Add more shadows and highlights. It can be quite a time-consuming process. I made another layer to help define this area a little bit more and set that to multiply. I erased this area just to help bring out the highlights again. And I paint in some more blood droplets as well. I copied a bit more of the horn layer just so I can add in some more streak lines. I don't really know what we would call those. I just kind of painted them in and adjusted them a little bit. I duplicated this layer and set the one underneath to black, and then blurred it and set it to soft light. I made another duplicate of that layer and set it to emboss. That would add a little bit more depth. I used the Gaussian blur a little bit more and set it to soft light. I then used the warp tool to change the length of the streaks a little bit more. And a few more highlights with the pencil tool again. Now that I'm satisfied with my texture, I made a new layer from visible, and I used the unsharp mask. With the horn texture complete, I'm going to now work on the opacity. I'm going to make a blood drop charm. I'm using black as the base, and then I'm going to draw in some white. That way I can easily use this as the opacity. I use the warp tool to make the shape how I want. I duplicated the layer and used the colorize tool to make it a nice dark red. I duplicated this layer, set it to multiply, and then used the soft eraser tool to block out some shading and highlight areas. Using similar methods as before, I start highlighting and shading the blood drop. I'm not going for the look of a gem, so I'm keeping the shading a little bit flatter. I don't have to worry about the UV map since it's just a square, and the opacity will be making the shape. With my texture done, I export that, and then I hide the other layers and use the black and white to export another file to be the opacity layer. I think it is a little bit big, so I'll go back and resize the texture. Now I can link all the layers so you can actually do this all at once. That way I can resize all the layers without having to merge them. Again, I have to export the texture and the opacity separately. Now that I'm happy with the proportions, I'm actually going to reduce the overall image sizes to reduce the KBS. After resizing this to 128 by 128 pixels, I choose the canvas, fit canvas to layers. I repeat the process for the opacity as well. Since the charm is so small, it doesn't really make much of a difference. The only real change is a smaller product size.